Hi everyone, welcome to the first session of 200 Years of Life 1 by Ben Woodard. This is the first part of a seminar with two independent modules. In this part, we will track the history, politics, and philosophy of biology over the course of the last 200 years, since biology cohered as a scientific discipline. We will attempt to break out of two critical dead ends in interpreting biology: political and historical limitations of analytic treatments of biology, and the disregard for biological history and scientific detail in continental philosophical discourses around the life sciences. Ben Woodard is currently a fellow at the ICI Berlin. He received his PhD in theory and criticism from Western University in 2016. From 2017 to 2020, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the IPK Leuphana University where he completed a habilitation on the analytic continental divide in philosophy through the work of F.H. Bradley. Since 2020, Ben has lectured at the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy, mostly on the history, philosophy, and politics of the life sciences. His work focuses on the relationship between naturalism and idealism in the 19th century. Ben also writes on science fiction and horror film and literature. He's the author of numerous articles and 3 books: Slime Dynamics, Generation, Mutation, and the Creep of Life, On an Ungrounded Earth, Towards a New Geophilosophy, and Shelley's Naturalism, Motion, Space, and the Evolution of Thought. So, Ben, please.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And thanks everyone for taking the course. And yeah, as was said, this is sort of, one module of 2. And so there's, of course, a lot to cover with the history of biology. And so this section of the course will sort of go up until the sort of mid-20th century, or about that. And so today we'll focus more on the kind of pre-biological notions and concepts which are relevant for understanding not only the history and politics of biology and the philosophy of biology, but also some of the deadlocks or some of the dead ends or problems of trying to talk about biology after the fact, or to talk about the history of biology after the fact in a certain way. Okay, so yeah, so that being said, there'll be sort of more of me talking today, and hopefully there'll be more discussion in towards the end and in future sessions. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of begin, or I should maybe first say, the hope is to try to talk about politics and history and philosophy without sort of shortchanging the other. But as we'll see, there's moments and sort of tendencies in each of those disciplines to kind of disregard and minimize one of the other 3. And so it's a real task to try to understand, how you can sort of hold on to all 3 at the same time. And that's really, I think, one of the biggest challenges. Okay. So I'm just going to put up my slides really quick and then get going. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see those. Right. So to start, I won't go over in detail the syllabus right now, just to remind everyone to look over it and check the readings. I'll try to mix secondary and primary readings. And like I said, going through to like the sort of mid-20th century. Some things will seem a bit eclectic, but often it's that I'm choosing things that give a broader historical view. And then we'll sort of have to kind of build the context around them. And then, yeah, we can talk about the sort of structure of the class towards the end. Okay, but to sort of get into the conceptual kind of meat of things, I think one of the obvious, it seems like an obvious statement, but it's sort of a very complicated one, right? That the history of biology is not the history of life, right? So it's often striking to people that when you find out that biology is a discipline, right? The word biology, even this idea of bios, it doesn't start being used in a way even close to what we mean today until around 1800, right? So several different people all at the same time, Lamarck and Trevineris, among them, all start using this word biology around between 1800 and 1803, and basically saying we need a science of life. And so that can seem very late, and the reasons why we'll get to in depth. But I think it's important to remember sort of how much of evolution and the contingencies of life and discussions of life had already taken place before biology emerges, right? And so to keep in mind also that all these disciplines that we might see as kind of beneath or contained within biology now, or within starting in the 20th century, of course, existed before it, right? So you think of something like medicine or even anatomy or physiology, right? These are now sort of subsets of biology, but of course, the practices involved in them were going on for a long, long time, thousands of years at least, before anything like biology came around. So I sort of emphasize that because part of my assertion or my belief about biology is that in a lot of the histories and textbooks, there's a short shrift given to the roles of concepts. And I think that concepts actually play a really important role in the history of biology and in the politics of biology. And there's, I think, at times almost an overemphasis on practice to the detriment of a conceptual understanding. And as we'll see, that's in part due to the way that sort of Anglophone scholarship of a particular type has kind of taken over understandings of the philosophy of biology in particular, but also the other disciplines as well. So yeah, this other kind of standard, just very general statement that I like to talk about and use in courses is this idea that the past is not dumb. So there's, and it's, again, this is in philosophy of biology texts, but even more so, I would say, in history of biology, there's a sense that, people had just bad ideas that we sort of found better ones over time. And again, this not only doesn't give proper attention to the role of concepts, what concepts were doing at a particular time, but it also assumes that there is a general attitude towards the sciences or towards inquiry that remains constant. And I think there's these very broad ways of viewing knowledge that do change, but it's very hard to see those changes after the fact, historically. So one of my sort of favorite, and I think criminally underread people is this Nicholas Jardine, who has written several books, but the one I find most useful is this one, The Scenes of Inquiry, where he sort of starts with reading a sort of history about romantic biology. He's talking about the Naturphilosophen Lawrence Oken, who, among others, also Goethe had a similar idea. Right? They talked about this notion that the skull, it's called the vertebrate theory of the skull, the idea that the skull sort of was a part of the spine that sort of bloomed like a flower. Right? So the idea that you could sort of see a vertebrate structure in the skull, and people nowadays just thinking that's a complete absurd, bizarre, totally wrong thing. Why would these people think something so stupid? So on and so on. And part of Jardin's point is that, like, well, they were trying to construct something like a science of morphology. And so, and what Jardin emphasizes is you have to understand what are the questions people are asking, right? So it's not just, you can't assume that the sort of field of knowledge acquisition is the same in terms of, like, values and general sort of even cosmologies, which shape the kinds of questions that are being asked. And if you see them as inferior versions of later developments, you completely miss what's actually going on, right? And so Jardin, I think, is particularly good about this, and most of his examples come from biology, which I find in particular useful. Okay. So then, to sort of get to the things and sort of content from this class, all right, to sort of talk about this tendency, particularly in the history of biology, but also again present in the philosophy of biology, to sort of jump over, I mean, for instance, this period that Jardin talks about, the Romantic biologists, for instance. So there's a lot of moves in, again, especially Anglophone texts, to talk a bit about Aristotle, who we'll talk about at length later today. Then sort of jump, to Kant, maybe not. Talk about, oh yes, the importance of purposiveness, right, of goal-oriented behavior in organisms, and then sort of jump more or less straight to Darwin with some notes about people that Darwin proved wrong. And that's a very sort of typical caricature that comes up again and again and again. And of course, that's, on the one hand, you sort of admit, or it's kind of obvious, that that's not the full history, but there's either an implied or an explicit claim made by the historians or the philosophers to say, well, this is the important stuff. Right? Everything in between Kant and Darwin, or sometimes even Aristotle and Darwin, isn't really important anymore. And of course, if you do that, you sort of lose all this, again, this conceptual understanding, and you lose a lot of historical understanding immediately. So part of what I'll try to do now is talk about what are some of the important things that happen in that space that are kind of left out, or why is that section, why are things sectioned that way? So if you take, for instance, this book, right, the Philosophy of Biology by Green and Depew, kind of a standard philosophy of biology text. It's almost like a textbook. You kind of get a similar structure to this. They do a little bit more. I think they mention Hegel briefly. They may mention Goethe briefly, but they really jump immediately to Darwin and say, yes, Darwin sort of fixed all this nonsense. And then they kind of move on and really sort of disparage all this philosophical work that comes, in between Aristotle and Darwin. And it's really telling. For instance, these people are very analytically minded in their philosophical approach. And you can see many traces of that in this kind of potted history, this kind of small, convenient history. For instance, the fact that later on in the book, they're talking about Sewall Wright, who was at the time one of the most famous population biologists of the early 20th century. He's kind of forgotten now compared to others of the same time. But they sort of talk about his philosophical interests and say, oh, how silly, he was an idealist. And we don't understand how you can be an idealist and be a biologist, because idealists don't think things really exist. So how could you study biology and think that? And so it's just a good case of how sort of ignorant they are about the history of continental thought, in that, one, Sewall Wright wasn't an idealist. He actually was a sympathetic to process philosophy, to philosophy of Whitehead, which many biologists of the first half of the 20th century were, especially in the US and UK. And of course, they show a complete misunderstanding of what idealism means, right? And the idea that any idealist must be an absolute idealist, or that if you think processes, right, take precedence over organisms as things, for instance, then therefore you can't do research, right? And this is a total misconstrual of what Wright believed, of what his philosophical sympathies were, which was Whitehead, and what idealism was, right? So this is just one case of how you get a very skewed idea of what idea of philosophy is being used when you talk about philosophy of biology nowadays. And because so much of the philosophy of biology that was done, again, between sort of, especially in the 19th century, is really erased or reduced to almost nothing. Okay. So the other part of this story, of course, is the Aristotle part. As I said, we'll talk about his, we'll talk about this kind of relationship to species. That was in one of the texts for today, towards the end of the class. So Aristotle is, of course, often seen as the first proper biologist, even though that's obviously there's a lot of retroactive projection going on, since there was nothing like biology. But especially in like this book by Lavoie, like the Lagoon, the fact is that because Aristotle spent so much time doing empirical research, or some proto form of empirical research, right, he's seen as sort of doing proper biology before he knew he was doing it. But again, this, there's a lot of assumptions about what Aristotle believed he was doing, which are being neglected on the one hand. And there's also this notion that doing empirical research, regardless of when that was occurring, is in itself already more biologically proper in terms of the kind of knowledge it's obtaining than other things. And of course, there's something true to the extent that, yes, Aristotle was doing dissections of sea creatures, for instance, and that he was drawing and, making models of things, but he was, seeing things in a particular way, which seemed radically incongruous with what we would see now, even though both are decidedly empirical, right? When you have a absolutely different worldview, you're not going to see the same organs as the same things. And this is clear in Aristotle's writings. The other obvious problem is that Aristotle, like many sort of pseudo-naturalists or naturalists after him, relied hugely upon travelers' documents and travelers' reports. So while you will have some firsthand knowledge of, creatures that can be found in Greece, for instance, or in this lagoon where he lived for a long time, he had to rely upon reports from people who had traveled elsewhere to, understand what like a rhinoceros might look like, for instance. And of course, as many people have probably seen, I think I have one of the images later on, a lot of the medieval reports look kind of skewed and really weird and seem highly inaccurate. And sometimes it's just an example of word of mouth. But again, sometimes it's also this conceptual apparatus is working and make things appear very non-empirical in a certain sense. So that stuff is all mixed together in Aristotle. And so even that kind of causes some problems to this fantasy of him. Not to say that he didn't do, like I said, some proper experiments, but him as a biologist sometimes overlooks these kind of incongruities. Okay, and then another thing which we'll talk about also more next week, but talk about a bit today, is also the kind of ever-increasing obsession with Kant in philosophy of biology circles. And again, with this whole idea of emphasizing purposiveness, and that Kant is the sort of originator of purposiveness. And for anyone familiar with Kant, this is this can be quite problematic, because you often have philosophers of biology reading selective parts of Kant. They'll read something from the first critique, or they'll only read something from the third critique. And there's, of course, a whole tradition of interpreting Kant, which is different in a lot of certain Anglophone or analytic circles. And so there's a sense that he sort of invents biology that to the extent that he really Kant emphasizes that organisms are things that have purposes, right? And so this is seen as a sort of contribution to biological knowledge, but the argument can be made, I would make this argument, that especially if you read the wording of like what he says, right, and not surprising if you know a lot about Kant, is that he's very cautious with his language. So he never says, right, organisms are things with purposes, right? He says we should treat organisms as if they have purposes, right? Again, not surprising in how Kant's general method and style, right? And so there's a whole question of like, what, is he really contributing something there to a sort of proto-biological knowledge, right? Kant dies before biology becomes a discipline, or he dies around the same time the word starts being used. And so there's also a question there about what really is the status of purposiveness of organisms in Kant. And it's also very telling, as I mentioned earlier, right, with the Jardine book, the fact that so many of these histories or so many of these philosophies of biology books jump over the Romantic period, for instance, like the immediate post-Kantian period, when you have lots of people dealing with organisms in great detail, right? Building on and tweaking and messing with the kind of things that Kant suggested, whether it's Goethe or Schelling, for instance, or the other Naturphilosophen, right? People like Trevineris or Killmeyer or Oken or others. And so, but they're seen as too weird or too unscientific, right? Because they're not cautious, because they're too speculative. And so there's a strange kind of deal that's made there that I think can cause quite some issues. Okay. And as, again, just to reiterate, if you take, I should say, it's often the case that people ask me like, what's like the best, or what's the philosophy of, or sorry, history of biology book I should read. And it's, of course, quite hard because there's not so many general history of biology books, right? Most of the time you have to sort of pick a subset of history, or you have to pick a particular issue, like the organism or evolution or something like this. There are a few, like this one by Morang on this history of biology. But again, there tends to be, and I think this is particularly the case with UK, US authors, is that there is an emphasis on personalities. So it's about the sort of, list of figures and scientists who made, the great contributions and the sort of methods they developed. And again, the sort of conceptual aspect of these things is neglected or erased, right? So even though I quite like this book, it doesn't really talk so much about how certain concepts shifted. It's more based, which of course many people prefer, on a kind of methodological, technological series of shifts. But as I want to keep trying to emphasize, and we'll see, especially later with the species concept, if you don't really pay particular attention to the conceptual in this way, it really becomes a problem if you want to understand what biology is doing at any particular point in time. And so there is, to not be all pessimistic, and, this is a book which one of the chapters was from today. There is a sort of another tradition, right, in STS, for instance. I'm sorry. So there is another tradition in science and technology of science and technology studies, which is much more conceptual, and is more interested in how certain ideas about biology has changed. And what's interesting there is that when you talk about the philosophy of biology, you sort of have this strong, or sort of, I should say, before the 1950s, 1960s, you do have a much stronger continental tradition of this work, right? Particularly in France. And so there is sort of what's often called, like, right, French philosophy of biology. It's sort of called that by, again, often more analytic-minded people. But this tradition basically, or for a large part, fizzles out with Foucault. I saw someone mention Foucault. And so you sort of get several, of course, you have a very strong tradition of biology in France. Some of the greatest naturalists are French, which we'll talk about later. And then you have, of course, Bergson's writing, and you have lots of people around the molecular revolution in the sort of 40s and 50s. But then once you get to Foucault, or once sort of Gangiem kind of work is over, and you get Foucault, that kind of tradition sort of peters out, and it merges and enters other disciplines. And I think like this, so when you say continental philosophy of biology, for instance, what that really means mostly nowadays is something like science and technology studies, which of course takes place not only in France, it takes place sort of all over. But it's kind of interesting in terms of the role of concepts and how it compares to history and philosophy of biology texts that are more, again, sort of like Anglophone centric, and that they tend to be more focused, right? So even though they emphasize conceptual work, or they will like touch upon people like Foucault or Michel Serres or or Whitehead, for instance, they tend to have a much narrower focus historically. And so there becomes a strange asymmetry in a lot of the between the disciplines, in that people doing science and technology studies, right, like Steigerwald, they will read, more philosophy and history, and they will talk about a sort of broader range of conceptual work than the sort of people doing philosophy of biology in an analytic sense. But people in the analytic world will not necessarily, doing philosophy of biology, will not necessarily read science and technology studies. So there becomes a kind of quite extreme asymmetry of reference. And some people have made the claim, which I think is often the case, that science and technology studies, the works are conceptually rich, but they are seen as too detached from the present. And they're sometimes treated as being too narrow in their political or social focus. So again, you have a sort of several pieces not quite lining up in a certain way. But yeah, we'll talk about that throughout the class. And so just to sort of make a point, or kind of take a case study or make a point about why I think it's important that these things have to be talked about all together. As if you take, one sort of very famous trajectory. So if you take somebody like Darwin, right, if you look at his early work, right, his reports from the Beagle, and then the Origin of Species from 59, and then the Descent of Man, which I think is 1873, if I remember right. There's a lot of across those three books, right? Just in one person's life, there's pretty massive shifts in terms of politics, at least explicitly stated, right? So for, the Beagle, Darwin is really adamant about his anti-slavery stance. He's sort of talking about the sort of criminality of it, like the horrors of it. He sort of becomes seemingly politically agnostic, it almost appears, in the Origin of Species. And then the Descent of Man, right, he's sort of happy to cite and promote eugenics, like eugenical work of people like Galton, his cousin. And just the point is, if you don't sort of understand why that was possible, how that's possible that such shifts could happen, right? That a lot of those had to do with certain conceptual commitments changing on the one hand, but all, also without simply reducing his political views or the shift in political views, even from the origin of species to the descent of man, as being, like, he's someone of his time, right? And the sort of weakness of that argument doesn't really tell you much about how sort of eugenics came to be and why it came to be when it did. And so, this is sort of to the point I said at the beginning. You have to try to hold on to the reins, right, you sort of have to have a finger on the politics, the history, and the biology all at once without sort of leaning too hard, right, towards one or another. Otherwise, you start to lose what biology actually is. And yeah, I mean, we'll talk at length about Darwin next week and sort of see how it's, of course, not only about Darwin, but it also becomes about this thing called the Darwin industry, right? So the sort of biographical, hagiographical kind of, proliferation of documents about him and critiquing him, and how he kind of becomes a stand-in for, what we might call modern biology. But as hopefully you already get the sense, right, the emphasis on Darwin is sort of deserved and exaggerated at the same time, depending on how you sort of view, what he did, right? But yeah, that'll be the emphasis of next week. So again, just sort of talking about broad historical strokes. As I said, you have this, you first have this kind of Aristotle, Kant maybe, and then Darwin kind of story, and then everything that comes after that. And so this emphasis on Darwin and then post-Darwin sort of starts, right, or really gets going in the 20th century, where this history becomes the sort of relevant history being told. And in one of the big books that sort of started to push this was this book, Evolution of Modern Synthesis, by Julian Huxley, who, for those interested, was the brother of Aldous, the grandson of T.H. Huxley, famously Darwin's bulldog, so defender of Darwin, especially against theologians, right? So that was the grandfather of Julian and Aldous. And so Julian Huxley writes this book, and this book really kind of becomes sort of the standard story for a long time. Even today, many biologists, and some historians of biology too, but many biologists, working biologists I've talked to, still kind of take this story as the story, with it essentially, as I said, there's kind of a few interesting precursors like Kant and Aristotle, but really it's about Darwin, and once Darwin comes in, everything changes. And then the sort of real great moment is that once Darwin's work, once the theory of evolution can be combined with a proper understanding of Mendelian genetics, right, this starts to happen like really late 1800s, early 20th century, and then the modern synthesis is when these things are really put together in the 30s and 40s. Depending on who you ask, the dates shift a decade or two, or sometimes 5 years. And this is then where you really get proper biology, right? So then already, this sort of 200 years, or at that point, like the sort of 150 years preceding, becomes sort of proto-biology, or becomes almost unnecessary. And the other important historical marker, which we'll talk about again more next week, is that there's a period, because even though people say Darwin kind of was the revolutionary moment, many of the decades following Darwin were people contesting and critiquing his work, and sometimes for good reason, sometimes for non-biological reasons, right? There's the kind of theological fight, but there was other more theoretical reasons, right? People weren't so sure about that contingency made sense in the way Darwin said it did, or that natural selection, was that something nature? How is that happening unintentionally, right? So you had a huge amount of post-Darwinian theories of evolution, which were which tried to interject some kind of teleology or direction that tried to downplay the contingency in some way. And Huxley in this famously calls this the eclipse of Darwinism. And this is a sort of grossly misleading and unhelpful thing in the sense that there's an assumption there, a suggestion that Darwin's theory was good enough already, with the publication of The Origin of Species, which even Darwin himself didn't believe, and that a bunch of people messed around, for several decades before they've, finally realized, oh, it is correct. And so that's a very kind of gross simplification of things. And it's another one of these moves by especially British, in particular in this case, scholarship that sort of obliterates everything as if nothing between Darwin and then the modern synthesis had any particular relevancy. Not only for understanding the history of biology, but also for understanding, understanding any, kind of notion of evolution. Okay, and so one of the other big questions that will sort of haunt the course and haunts this kind of question is this notion of, how did you have a sort of discipline of biology, as I said, right? The history of life is not the history of biology, so you have a lot of various retroactive moves. And again, that's about the kinds of questions that people think are worth asking. So even this notion of how do you get life from non-life, right, which is still an unanswered question. There's still lots of competing theories about that. Do you have right? The way you try to answer that question, or even ask that question, shifts quite radically back and forth. And so whether that's even a question that can be answered, some people, and then when you get these kind of massive rewritings of history, the kinds of ways that question is answered gets re-emphasized, right? So after the sort of modern synthesis, right, the emphasis becomes life should be understood in informational terms, right? Sort of DNA or RNA sort of sequences. And then of course there's a pushback, like should life be understood as metabolic processes, right? So here's like a picture of a sea vent, right? So this is another theory, like, no, you should think about the origin of life chemically, right? It's something that you get, simple marine organisms or simple bacteria or something like that being able to hijack a huge energy output, like from a sea vent in the floor of the ocean, and kind of get a sort of, and then, from that, you'll eventually get a sort of metastable and then eventually self-regulating and then sort of self-augmenting process, right? But of course, these are all very speculative, sort of, and then, even Darwin, right, had his kind of pool of ooze, right? Primordial ooze, things come up from this. And, if you, I should say, if you sort of treat those questions are often treated as a post-Darwinian problem. Of course, those questions were asked before. And then again, you have to understand, right, this kind of conceptual, this conceptual view of things. And this goes back to the Jardine issue, right? What questions are people asking and why? And then again, these periods of history that are being erased or forgotten. And that the very question of what is life, right, is going to take very different forms relative to a historical context and to a philosophical context. And that if you don't know about those, right, you're going to get very different answers, and also to very different questions. So I have some issues with some chapters in this book, but this book by Riskin, which got a lot of press and a lot of attention, The Restless Clock, I think she makes this point very well. And so right, and it's something that people forget in terms of general views of what counts as alive, right? So just as this question, and I think you can kind of see this as a proto version of the question, what's the relationship between the inorganic and the organic? You also have to think about like what's the question of life and non-life, or what does a living or aliveness mean? And so she makes the point, she talks quite a lot about sort of medieval period and then the kind of early, right, sort of early modern and in Renaissance and early modern period. She talks quite a bit about Descartes. And with this idea that has come to dominate, I think, a lot of kind of think piece or short form articles about life, or sometimes critical theory texts will talk about, oh, the machine, this kind of machine model of someone like Descartes, or this kind of idea that organisms are just a machine, how this is a kind of horrible, right, kind of sort of monstrous idea. And in a lot of cases, that completely misses the important point that Descartes made. Not that I want to defend Descartes, I have lots of problems with Descartes, but the idea that like being called, part of the point is that being called a machine, if it's the early modern period and you say someone is a machine, that their body is a machine, that's like fine. That's not a problem, because what matters is that you have a soul. And even better, if you're a human being, you have a rational soul, right, which moves the machine. So when Descartes or other, also late medievalists have this, we describe organisms as being like levers and pulleys and, conveyor belts later, or weights and counterweights and all this stuff, right? This is a functional explanation, or an attempt at functional explanations of living things and how they move, right? But this doesn't make them any less alive, right? Because the property of life is a theological question, right? And so there's often a mistake, I think, in a lot of histories, or again, I think it's not even in-depth histories at times. I think it often comes up in critical theory or some continental work where there's just a sense of like, oh, like this is killing what's important about life. But the point is, this kind of mechanical understanding couldn't touch what was considered alive, because what was alive was not a biological phenomenon. And so part of what I want to talk about today is how that changed, right? And how the sort of conceptual commitments of certain types made it possible to start to really biologicize, if we want to say that, human life. But also that even before that happened, you had to sort of construct various notions of life that were workable or alterable in certain, small ways, in order to sort of get over some of these theological or philosophical blockages, to, right, again, and this is why does it take until 1800 till we have something called biology, right? This is one of the reasons why. So one of the like really helpful books, though of course it's limited to Germany, but a really helpful book in this sense is Zemito's Gestation of German Biology, which, as it says on the cover, right, it kind of goes from Stahl to Schelling. And what Zemito and others also doing kind of history of science, again, especially in this, like I said, neglected period, right? So this romantic or post-Kantian broadly, or sort of pre and post-Kantian period, is that, right, understanding, right, there is, of course, like good sort of STS scholar, there's these shifts in method, in approach, and techniques, but that these are always kind of carried by, or often, promoted or discouraged by other competing conceptual, right, apparatuses. And so like one thing that Zemito does, which is really important, is that is sort of looking at biology in the context of these sciences which preceded it, right, but which we now view as kind of subservient or as supporting it, right? So again, like medicine being one of the biggest ones. And so it's sort of through a kind of series of kind of cross-pollination, where you get, on the one hand, because physics becomes more granular in the kind of 1600s, once you get people applying, on the one hand, people starting to try to apply physics to chemistry, and then that kind of more quantified notion of chemistry being slowly applied to things like anatomy, right, or to anatomical processes like breathing or blood flow, or saturation of a chemical when it's ingested, right, studies of poisons, right. You start to get this quantified approach via physics, via especially Newtonian physics, then through chemistry, and then into medicine, is one of the ways, and particularly in France and Germany, but it manifests quite differently, is where you really start to get biology as we would sort of see it now, starting to emerge. But again, you have still to deal with these kind of retroactive histories, which kind of downgrade the importance of these things, or misread them, when in fact there's quite important conceptual developments going on. So one of the figure that one of the figures that Zamito spends quite a time on, and who's somebody who's kind of known, if you work in maybe a kind of pre-Kantian context, you might know, or if you do history of medicine, but otherwise might not be a familiar figure, right, is Ernst Stahl. And Stahl is the person that's often credited with inventing, or at least inventing / promoting, the idea of organism, right? So again, why does it seem to take so long to get something like the concept of organism going? And again, at least in the German case, right, the case that Zamito talks about, for instance, the reasons for this are largely theological, because, and again, it's hard for us, in a contemporary moment, to imagine medicine being so locked in and so limited, but that was the case during Stahl's time. And so Stahl was a pietist, which was essentially people who tried to restart the Reformation a second time, to sort of go back to sort of pragmatic, on the ground kind of things, via religion, so lots of social welfare type of things, not letting the church get bogged down in excessive finances and so on. So Stahl was a doctor, and at the time, even people who were interested in chemistry, many of them doubted, especially in Germany, less so in France, doubted that chemistry would be useful for medicine. So while there's a kind of series of French Newtonians, chemists, who kind of went whole hog on that concept, some of the Germans were more skeptical. But what's interesting about Stahl is that he starts to kind of say, well, for medicine to develop, we need to think about the body. We need to think about living things as something that we can work on, right, in this very pragmatic medical way. Some things are still up to God, basically. But how do you sort of give the physician a sort of object to work on in general about health that is, more scientifically graspable, but that still doesn't sort of violate any kind of religious tenets and this kind of thing, right? And so essentially what Stahl does is he creates this notion of the organism, right? So, and why that's important is because the organism was a way of sort of updating and moving beyond some of these medieval trappings of like the humors, or the thing that like the body needs to be kept in balance, right? And there was this sense, right, this quite well-known sense that the body would usually, if the body was disrupted, or sickness or some problem, right, it was something that came from without, right, from outside. And increasingly, Stahl and medical science of his time starts to kind of say, well, maybe things can kind of get messed up internally, because maybe things get disorganized, right? That the system isn't organized properly. right? And so this is where the notion of the organism starts to kind of gain footing and get used. And sort of once, and it's actually interesting that at the time, Kant and other people accused, and sometimes people still do, accuse Stahl of vitalism. And this is again a problem that we'll run into many times, that, vitalism very often, as Amito makes this point as well, and other people, other historians of science have made this point, vitalism is very often an insult hurled at somebody, and less so, at least in this time period, something that people take up proudly. Vitalism is often a sense of like just using an unexplained explainer in biology. Kant actually goes back on this in his later life and says, no, actually, I was too harsh on Stahl. Actually, I think what he was doing was important. Because, it's quite striking to accuse Stahl of being a vitalist, because he's just trying to come up with a concept to do practical work on an organism, right? But, if remembering what I said about the kind of about Riskin's book on Descartes and the idea of what animates life, that as soon as, for many people, it can look like you're taking a theological notion and trying to nudge it into the material world. And of course, that looks like vitalism, right? You're saying there's something special about life that is unexplainable, right? Which is not what Stahl is doing. But it can look like that if you have this very theologically loaded notion of animation, right? That life is being animated by a soul or a spark of life or something like this. So as soon as you start to take the engine of life away from theology and say maybe something about this is actually biological, we don't use that word yet, but we say maybe some of this is like graspable, workable, medically, physiologically, anatomically, you can be accused of being a vitalist. So that's something to keep in mind. It's often like a sort of, a curse more than anything else. Not always, and we'll talk about that in the sort of third week. But once, after Stahl, kind of the gates are open, and you start to have more and more people. Again, I'm talking mostly about Germany here. I'll talk about France a bit later. Is that you have, right, with someone like von Haller, you have these new discourses, and this is not only Germany, you get this in France and also England and Scotland and various other places in Europe at the time, where you get this discourse about other ways of making life forms more material, or trying to understand the materiality of organisms and of living things and of living processes. One of which is, in von Haller's case, you get this one of many people who start to talk about things like sensibility and irritability, right? So this becomes one of the ways physiology starts to kind of speculate and push into something like biology, because there's a sense that, what is more important, or what if organisms are sort of powering themselves, how do we want to talk about this? So sensibility, right, would be an emphasis on, well, it's the senses, right? It's the outside influences of breathing and sight and warmth and all this kind of stuff, which kind of pushes and motivates living things to react and move. Or you might talk about, in that notion of sensibility, and this gets very complicated, especially in the post-Kantian period, right? That how aware, how conscious of we are that or not. But then you also get this discourse of irritability, right? And which is often this discourse about the muscles, right? You say, well, the senses, right? A sense, but then the muscles and maybe nerves are also affected in ways that are not conscious, right? So you get, like, we talk about reflexes and contractions and sudden, effects of the organism by outside forces which are not detectable always or even controllable. And of course, you get a huge discourse on this well into the 1900s, right, with trying to understand this discourse. And this, again, is wrapped up in differing interpretations of chemistry, right? Whether you have these Newtonian approach or this more kind of systems approach, in the sense of to understand how the nerves or the muscles work, right? You get lots of things about, right, electrical experiments, which we'll talk about in a second, but also gas, right? The idea of like gases and how gases interact with living things becomes a huge way of trying to, make biology a sort of science by using chemistry, right? So the ideas of respiration, right? And how the blood, relates to what's breathed in by the organism, and this type of how this relates to sensibility and reflexivity, right? The kind of anatomical reactions like breathing, which are not conscious, but then how that relates to how we perceive certain things, because without air, so then you get certain dependability, contingency relationships between these things, interpreted either in more quantitative or less quantitative ways across sort of different interpretations of what you can do with physics in chemistry, and then chemistry into biology. So it gets very complicated, and the Zamito book does a really good job. But then again, at each step of reading these histories, right, you always get this impulse by historians to denigrate them, or to say these were like stupid ideas, which we've kind of gotten over now. But right, again, that misses the kind of slow, necessary work of constructing, the organism, right, and then constructing the anatomical body as this kind of systems, this self-regulating but not perfectly regulating system, right? All these things are constructed very slowly. And a nice corrective to some of these bad histories is like this book, Shocking Frogs, which is a really great one, because it tells a story about Volta and Galvini, right? And it's like all these stories of vitalism, you also get this kind of, again, this potted history, right? These kind of convenient histories about how things developed and went. And so, for instance, the common story you get with Galvini and Volta, right, is that, well, Galvini, they both did experiments on frogs, basically touching frog legs to electrical devices and seeing, right, the muscle reaction. And that Galvini, had this stupid theory of animal electricity or animal magnetism, right? That he thought that, oh, there was some special force in the animal that was activated by the magnet, whereas Volta was the much better experimenter, and he understood, well, it's just generally electrical, right? It just means there's electrical forces in non-living things and living things, right? And so that's like, he was the one who was correct and had to like fight off this nonsense about Galvini. And as the book shows, that's a really bad history. And if you read a lot of the documents that people use to sort of say Galvini didn't know what he was doing, for instance, that's complete nonsense. They'll say like, oh, he had all these frog legs just lying around and decided to play with them one day. It's like, what? What do you mean? Like, he had a laboratory, So again, you get these really sloppy retrojections. And if you read the details of like what Galvini was doing, people say, oh, animal electricity, that's nonsense. But you have to know the details of the chemistry that they were both doing. And so for Galvini, it's not that he didn't think electricity could be both in the living world and outside the living world, but he wanted to know what's happening inside these like frog legs that make them still react when they're electrified, even when they're dead. And so he wanted to know what's the chemistry inside the muscles and the tissues that makes this still work, right? So he called it animal electricity, right? Because he's essentially trying to understand what's the chemical interaction between nerves, muscles, and tissues, right? Whereas Volta wasn't interested in that question, right? Volta was like, well, electricity clearly has a role in biology, but he's more interested in, viewing organisms as a sort of receptacle for energy, right? This is why you kind of get Volta to develop something like a battery, right? In part to these experiments. So for him, he sees organisms as a subset of electrical systems. Whereas for Galvini, right, he sees that, but what he wants to know is what makes it work. What makes muscles work in this electrical way? So what's the electricity the function of electricity specific to living systems. And that's why he calls it animal electricity, not because he thinks it's like a pseudo-vitalist thing. And so again, you can get these really, sort of sloppy histories. And then just, other episodes that are worth mentioning, right? You kind of get Tremblay's work on the Hydra, right? So another way in which physics kind of influences and directs early sort of proto-biology, if you want to call it that, right? And sort of 1700s is, again, some people maybe, even if you've read a little bit about biology or biological history, you often hear this discourse about preformationism versus epigenesis, right? So this debate about whether life comes fully formed. I thought that the whole blueprint for life is kind of already there at inception, either in the egg or in the sperm, and that it just kind of unfolds, right, according to a program. Or is it, that no, there's kind of a less formed matter which gets affected by the environment and kind of directs it in various ways so that it grows and develops, right? Which is the kind of epigenesis view. And so, again, many times the histories project the idea that, well, preformationism was very stupid and beaten by the epigenesis one quite quickly. And of course, you actually see a much more complicated back and forth dialectic between these things, which seems like anathema to this kind of the lazy progressive rationalist historians, simply because you look at the technological emphasis of things that with people like Tremblay or others, inspired by Leeuwenhoek, who is, what's sort of seen as the kind of father of microbiology with his quite advanced microscopes, that as microscope technology improved, for instance, you could see finer and finer detail. So if you were a preformationist, you could simply argue, well, yeah, the plan, the blueprint is there. It's just tinier and tinier and tinier. Right. So there was no like simple like winning out of these things. But again, this debate is in many ways it's this kind of conceptual debate, which is important, but it's also about how that intersects with the technological advancements, right? So, having better microscopes doesn't give you like a better in the sense of being more like our modern concepts of biology. If you already have conceptual, leanings towards certain things, of course, then, again, this goes back to what I said about Aristotle. You can be a good empiricist, but if you don't think it's possible that you're seeing what you're seeing, that doesn't matter. And so this continues on for quite some time. And then, you also get similar issues with the early days of morphology. So also in the same time period, more or less, with Wolff, you get, all this debate about, how do we track and understand the relationship between development, right? How is development thinkable in a kind of, is it a set of kind of more or less neutral developmental units, which kind of, because of environmental changes, right, will suddenly take a different path, or how much of this is sort of pre-programmed, how much of this is the question of the matter of the stuff involved, right, in development, how much of it is the matter, where it's the embryonic matter or the ovum, like what is a particular special type of materiality, right? And again, this is where you get in some way, some people following this in the chemical way, in this kind of quantitative manner, but then the German tradition tends to reject this and say, no, we will have to understand this like real like genealogy, historical account of development, and then kind of figure out the theory from that, not sort of do this kind of chemical approach. And this kind of split also has sort of national consequences in various ways. And then, of course, while all of this is going on, right, in the 1600s, 1700s, you also have different constructions of classification, right? So before you have biology, of course, right, you have naturalists, right? Like Darwin, right? Darwin was not a biologist, he was technically a naturalist. And so somebody that had this kind of broad systematic view of things, but that often had but again, this differed person to person and tradition to tradition, how speculative your system was versus how empirical it was in the sense of collecting samples and sort of building things. Right, so you have endless literature on Linnaeus, who's the first person pictured here, right, with how arbitrary or not any classificatory system is, right? Like mammal seems like a weird category, right? And then how do you place things, right? What are the hierarchies involved? Like the notion of higher and lower organism becomes very strange and odd. And then, of course, as time goes on, these systems intersect with other sciences in various ways, which redirect them in interesting manners. So you have Buffon right in the middle, where, of course, the notion of extinction, but also the notion of biology as a sort of something deeply related to geology, right, starts to happen, and the whole question of paleontological evidence, right. You don't start to find things, right, like of the past in certain places. You find more of certain things in other places. So this, of course, is going to have contingent effects on the system. And then with someone like Cuvier, who's the last person on the right, you have, somebody who's letting their view of biology seep into the classificatory system even more, right? So the fact that whereas Linnaeus might sort of try to, just take a broad view of things and order things in terms of certain degrees of similarity, which isn't the way even Aristotle did it in a different way. Someone like Cuvier might, because he views life in a very functionalist manner, right? So things should be classified by what they're capable of doing, right? That's going to give you, again, a very different organization and classification of life, right? So the actions that organisms are capable of are more important for Cuvier than their morphological similarity to other things, right? So already the classificatory systems, which were kind of broader and more about just collecting data early on, actually become narrower in a certain sense later, even though you think that wouldn't be the case, because certain biological concepts start to creep in. And, there's, of course, lots of nasty, politically speaking, consequences of this. And you get a whole set of debates arising at this time, right, with these classificatory systems, especially later in the 1700s, and then in the 1800s, once you get, right, the organism concept, and then you get biology as a concept, right, you have the sort of various racial classifications kicking in. And of course, you had these before in various ways, but then, and of course, lots of racist implications in like how things were ordered and hierarchized in Buffon already. But then, of course, these systems are used to justify, right, various forms of colonialism and, pseudoscientific racism. And so, but then, of course, these things also get bound up with very general ideas about biology and what biology would count as evidence or not. So in Blumenbach and Kant, right, you sort of see anthropology playing a real role in biology as well, right? So the fact that the whole the degree to which racial classifications of peoples in Blumenbach, he sort of has this very standard hierarchy of white Europeans at the top. And yet at the same time, he'll say things like, oh, well, this is just an aesthetic, this is just an aesthetic distinction. But then, you'll have at the same time, this is accompanied by really racist anecdotes about cultural practices being, morally unacceptable. And of course, Kant takes this and runs with it, really far in his anthropology lectures, right? Not so much published material, but in these notes and lecture notes he gave, right, these classification systems become very quickly used by and for anthropological justifications of racism, and we'll talk about this throughout the whole course. But this whole idea, and also to say this whole idea of racial classification and like the capacities of certain peoples over others gets bound up with this teleology and purposiveness, right? The idea that, well, the capacities of some peoples exceed others, right? And then get the higher and lower organisms thing plays into this. But then you get very complicated shifts over time, which we'll talk about also next week with Darwin and post-Darwin understandings of things. How this kind of uses a kind of a distinction within humans. This becomes like a species distinction at one point, then it shifts to being a sort of so-called cultural distinction or sort of anthropological distinction, and that how this sort of human animal line is used to justify, right, all kinds of atrocities, but that the dehumanization of certain peoples is not necessarily an animalization of them, right? It's that often certain peoples are seen as more animal-like, right? And Zakiah Jackson has a really good argument about this. But this is just to say that like the play between anthropology and biology in this kind of early stage allows this to happen. And so that certain people get to decide the classificatory system, being more or less animal-like, or that species is more or less inclusive. The line is often redrawn decade to decade based on political reasons more than anything. But that's something we'll talk about, more next time. And also, right, so people probably know Tom's book, right? And I mentioned this 2 slides ago. This whole question of extinction, right, also becomes something that really is really important for biology. And this is also, right, the fact that once you discover fossils of things that don't seem to exist anymore, or once you discover fossils of fish inside of a mountain, right, that you start to get massive excavations, right, in this kind of proto and then into the industrial period, right, really in the 1800s. So there's a lot of unintentional and then intentional, more so, discoveries of these fossil bodies, which seem to upset, right, the understanding of, any kind of inherent progressiveness in nature, right? This thing that Tom has talked about in this book, this idea of, right, this principle of plenitude, this idea that theologically speaking, and this is again where you kind of get the shift away from theological notions of life, this idea that, why would God create a life form and let it go extinct, right? And so you either have to kind of have a sort of moral judgment on animals, how you classify them, which of course people, did. If you read the kind of things that Linnaeus said about sloths, for instance, that's kind of clear. He doesn't think of them very highly. But otherwise, you have to sort of integrate this notion of extinction into humanity, which again, advances in many ways this notion of higher and lower forms, more or less advanced, who's going to survive. Of course, this will play into Darwin in various ways. But also, right, the kind of the more functionalist view of things, like in Cuvier, also gets a sort of boost from this, right? The sense that, well, if things don't properly function, organisms fail, and that's the end of them. And so, right, that also injects a certain sort of biological weight to human existence that wasn't there before. And, this with this kind of, once you kind of get this with these classification systems and how useful or not useful they are, you also kind of get various degrees of speculation, right? And which again, with extinction becomes very important, right? Because, why did these things come to be? What did these things look like? If you have a very limited selection of their bones, and so you also get debates about, and this goes back to the story, this is connected to the story that I said towards the beginning with, that Jardine talks about, right, with Oken and Goethe, this, theory of the skull kind of speculatively weird stuff. A lot of this kind of theory kicks off. You get a lot of it in the 1800s in particular, one of which is this kind of big debate between Cuvier and Geoffroy, which is essentially a debate. I mean, for those of you who read Deleuze and Guattari, you might know it. It's mentioned by them. But that you have this kind of debate essentially between a functional understanding of organisms and a more morphological or like a more form-based understanding of organisms, right? And this is where the discourse about transformationism also starts to become more and more relevant, right? With transformationism being this kind of proto-Darwinian, proto-evolutionary ideas, right? So the idea that, right, if you have a classification system like Linnaeus's, which even, seems quite strict, you still have him giving room for things like hybrids or mixes, or, there's still a question of how much can species transform themselves, how much can species mix across lines, right? These kinds of questions, feed into this notion of something like evolution may be happening. And so you get this debate between Cuvier and Geoffroy, because Geoffroy basically has this kind of transformationist model saying, yeah, species can transform into other species. And these two students, whose we don't even have their full names, kind of present this paper and say, look, morphologically speaking, you can basically take two wildly different organisms, like a mollusk, which is, there's a mollusk, species of mollusk here, pictured. You can take a mollusk and you can rearrange it into a mammal, basically, right? If you kind of move all the parts around, you play with it like Play-Doh, you can kind of get a not totally different species. So that could happen in nature to some degree. Why not? And Cuvier was like very incensed by this and thought, no, there's nothing, species lines or lineages don't interact. Like a species, and this is in part because of his functionalism, right? He says a species kind of has what it has. If it doesn't function well, if it doesn't succeed, it dies. And so this is why he's also really into extinction. Right? It's like, there's no transformation, there's no mixing there. And you'll see there's many times where Cuvier will be sent samples of organisms and they'll say, look, he was famously sent specimens of axolotl. Right? These are these salamanders from around Mexico City who change rapidly depending whether they're in water or not. Right? So they can look and they sort of maintain their juvenile characteristics late in life. They're very neotenous is the word. And Cuvier just denied that these samples could be the same species. He's like, no way, impossible. And he was, proven wrong. But just to show again, he was so dead set on the fact that species were kind of stuck in a track and then they survived or didn't survive, that he couldn't imagine any kind of morphological or any kind of transformative thing being possible, right? So even though a lot of people accepted some degree of transformation, there still wasn't enough, there wasn't like a sort of conceptual push for it that was sort of seen as adequate to sort of justify such a sort of speculative theory in his view and in the view of many others. Okay. So another thing to talk about, again, kind of broad strokes, is this notion of kind of counterfactuals, right? So again, this is part of this kind of retrospective or retrojective histories, and sort of how speculation plays out or how it's viewed in biological history in particular. Right, it was this counterfactual, like how things could have been otherwise, right? And you get this at the level of biology, like how could have evolution or how could have biology been otherwise, but also kind of how could the history of biology have been otherwise, and how do those things intersect or not? So this book by Bowler is a very well-known historian of biology and has written also stuff about kind of the more neglected periods of history of biology. he kind of he imagines like what would biology look like if Darwin hadn't published The Origin of Species. Right, so the book sort of begins with Darwin on the Beagle, and he falls off the side of the ship and drowns. And so it's okay, like what would biology look that different today? And it's just a kind of game sort of to play with. Look, it's a way to sort of do history in a sort of different light. But there's other forms of this which are more tricky and to deal with, where you're going to get different retrojections that are motivated for different political and historical reasons. So, for instance, Lamarck, I haven't mentioned yet, in that Cuvier debate, Geoffroy and the students of Geoffroy, who were the sort of really pro-morphological experimentation and transformation, they were inspired in part by Lamarck, right? And Lamarck is also somebody who sort of coined the word, or started using the word biology around 1800. And, people might know, right, his sort of Lamarckian evolution, or the thing that Lamarck is often attached to, if people don't know anything else about him, is this, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, right? So this idea that, the typical example that people often make fun of is that, if an organism in its life altered its structure, then it's that alteration at the level of the body could affect its offspring, right? So the example that gets used all the time is, if a giraffe stretches its neck out over its life to sort of reach higher and higher leaves on the tree, then its children will inherit that stretched neck, right? And of course, so this was sort of laughed at and seen as really silly, but of course, there's various problems with that. One is that this notion of that you could inherit those kinds of characteristics, that those could be passed on, right? That acquired characteristics, right? Something in the life of the organism could be passed on. That was a pretty common belief, right? It was not special to Lamarck at all. Darwin even thought, oh, something like that is probably true. It was a kind of a general thing. People thought like something like that probably happens. But I think what was more threatening was that Lamarck had this very materialist view of evolution, right? So that Lamarck really thought that, of course, he didn't call it evolution; he called it transformation, right? That transformationism, that species changed because they were totally immaterial beings. They were like blobs of matter with fluids flowing around inside of them, and of course, things are going to happen to them, which is going to affect their offspring, right? So to him, it was just kind of a general thing. But of course, with epigenetics, right, which we'll talk about towards the end of this class, but right, there's people saying, oh, well, like Lamarck has been vindicated, right? And so you get people saying, no, there isn't. There is certain inherited behaviors, right? And certain like molecular or like hormonal changes, or there are certain material changes that are acquired, are inherited to some degree, right? And so then you have people sort of going back and sort of like Eva LeBlanca is one of the most famous people doing this, sort of like, championing Lamarck and saying Lamarck was right. And of course, with this, you have to be very careful that you're like, okay, what part of Lamarck was right? Or this is sometimes taken as like just being an anti-Darwinian argument, and this way, which Darwin are you being against? Right. So it can get very kind of it can get very imprecise. Not to say that there isn't something good to it, that people should go back and read Lamarck. It's important because he was seen as such a sort of clown for such a long time. But that with that revisitations, you have to be careful you're not just sort of committing the same mistake in the opposite direction. You also get, similar counterfactual histories, but with a more political bent, especially regarding, right, the sort of mid 20th century, sort of pre and post, or sort of pre and then pre-Cold War and Cold War understandings of biology. As I mentioned before, there was a lot of UK biologists in the 30s and 40s who are really into like Whitehead and process philosophy. And there's a big crossover between those thinkers. Like Waddington is one of the most famous ones, but there's many others. Waddington sort of is sort of seen, kind of coined or sort of started epigenetics as a kind of study. But a lot of them were sort of Marxist, very sympathetic to Marxism, and were doing a kind of Marxist biology. And of course, in most histories of biology, or even by most biologists, anything that's connected to Marxism is rejected outright as being kind of falling under this disastrous, right, Lysenko experiments, right? So Lysenko, again, going back to epigenetics, right? Lysenko kind of does these experiments in the Soviet Union where he sort of cold shocks or heat shocks, right? So you expose seeds, right, to extreme temperatures to kind of hope that they'll inherit that and then pass it on, right, to future plants, and that will make them more resistant to, winters in the Soviet Union, this kind of thing. And of course, it sort of was a disaster and our starvation, and the reasons for that are largely, political in the extent that Lysenko was just, he buddied up with the party. But then you sort of get these attempts to sort of rewrite that history or kind of deal with like what was actually political, what was properly biology, like what happened there, right, with this book by Levins and Lewontin. And so you also kind of get these political counterfactuals, like what would happen if Marxist biology had been done properly, or socialist, biology had been done properly, right? Because all this interesting stuff that was happening, not only in the Soviet Union, but also in the UK and in the US to an extent, a lot of it was crushed, especially once you get the Cold War, right? The largest funding bodies for biological experiments, things like the Rockefeller Foundation, wouldn't give money to anybody who had ever been a Marxist. So just even that kind of wipes out huge research programs. And so you get a lot of talk about, okay, what was lost there? And you still get a lot of really silly, I mean, to this day, if you talk to, which I've done, biologists or ecologists in Europe, or even in Europe and in the US, they're just, anyone who's even kind of associated with Marxism historically is just like, no, they will not talk about them. So that also kind of creates a strange set understanding of history. Also a part of this, so again, another kind of counterfactual or sort of underdog, you get these sort of underdog stories in biology, history of biology. Jan Sapp is someone, he's written a lot of books I really like. But again, there's always this danger because he sort of has written quite a lot about the history of symbiosis, and especially about other kind of underappreciated figures in cell theory, right? Cell theory was kind of pushed aside once you sort of got the rush for DNA happening. So understanding the mechanisms of the cell, which was had such a long, rich tradition, especially in Germany, but outside of it. And then also, someone who's championed the work of Margolis and this sort of symbiotic theories of evolution. And again, as somebody who was neglected and critiqued. And there's a lot of truth to that. But again, you get this danger. You get this danger of sort of overinflating one story to sort of take revenge on the sort of standard stories. So again, there has to be a kind of balance there. Because also, even if you sort of swing too hard in the other direction, people will just immediately see you as being too political, quote unquote, whatever that means, and then will reject, your sort of alternate telling of things. And so it's just a very easy way for people to not listen to those kinds of stories, to just kind of say, well, you're just a sort of crazy lefty, or you're just you just want revenge, so we don't have to listen to you. And of course, then the sort of knowledge gets lost a second time. Okay. So yeah, I think this is the only slightly funny slide this week. there's a lot of these bad evolution memes. Yeah, so the other question is sort of how is, all these different ways biological history is done, whether it's counterfactual histories, whether it's the standard kind of potted version, right, of Aristotle, Kant, Darwin, modern biology, whether it's these sort of alternative or neglected histories, how much they tend to be philosophical or speculative, how much they sort of emphasize the empirical, and how much they are about the biographies of the scientists, right? All these different ways of doing it. With all that, then of course you have the question of how is this deployed? How are these histories deployed within biology? How are they deployed in connection to the political history? How are they deployed or placed or used outside of biology? And so, of course, the most probably infamous example of this is eugenics, which, we'll talk about more next week because that's more the sort of historical period for its kind of heyday. But you look at eugenics, the way that the history is told or isn't told is, of course, quite complicated, but it in the period sort of right before and then really accelerating with after Darwin, not because of Darwin's theories per se, right? You get eugenics essentially becomes a way of people taking ideas from animal husbandry, right? So how to raise healthier livestock or how to have like fatter pigs or whatever, right? Those ideas kind of start to get applied to human beings, right? And so it gets a little bit accelerated by certain bad understandings of Darwin. It's kind of social Darwinism. But it also gets accelerated by other things, which are sometimes forgotten a bit. One is, of course, you get the rediscovery of Mendelian genetics, right? So Mendel's work is kind of, done around the same time as Darwin, but then it's sort of forgotten mostly, and then gets rediscovered and talked about at length around 1900, right? Yeah. So like the term biology, you also get three people working all at once on these papers of Mendel and saying, okay, maybe, there's something here about how inheritance functions, right? Darwin didn't really have a theory of inheritance. He kind of did a hand wavy thing and said there's some kind of mix between the parents, but I don't really know. So once you have that rediscovered, and then once you have this kind of industrial processes, increasingly industrial processes of animal husbandry, at the same time, right, you kind of get this, this stuff building up and happening. And then once you like leading up to World War I, and then especially after World War I, you also get huge worries and concerns about national identity, right? And Mary Sturda has written many, many books and done lots of work on this, which are very good in the sense that you have after World War I in particular, you have a crisis of national identity because suddenly countries have to sort of become countries outside of the empires they were sort of shuffled under. And then suddenly you have to ask, okay, what makes a good, Romanian? What makes a good Greek person? Or, what does it mean to belong to a place? And so you get a lot of this discourse about bloodlines and lineages, and then like which certain behaviors are considered good or not. And this kind of combines with this, proto-genetics badly understood with this kind of, a second wave of colonialism, right? Sort of industrial Victorian age colonialism. And of course, these all things kind of create eugenics as a kind of global phenomenon. And so sometimes forgotten, because of the sort of Nazi being the sort of pinnacle or like extreme explosion of eugenics, right? That of course it was inspired by American eugenics, right? They basically copied the eugenics laws from the US in large part. But also that eugenics or some form of it was found across the entire planet practically, and in almost every political alignment. Like there were anarchist eugenicists, there were left-wing eugenicists, there was right-wing. I mean, they took different forms, but some form that it was almost ubiquitous across the planet. And so understanding how that was possible is also, yeah, something we'll talk about next week. And it's also something about, what bits of biology are kind of cherry picked in order to try and justify those programs. And then, again, the sort of typical story with how biology is used outside of biology, right? That after the war, right, the UN sort of writes this famous text about race. Race is not a scientific issue. They make several versions of it. It's contested. It doesn't address the global South at all. And then, right, a lot of these issues then sort of come back to life in the 60s and 70s, and you get really polarized battles, again, the stories of which are retold, I think, in misleading ways, often between, right, sort of so-called leftist and kind of Marxist sympathetic scientists, represented maybe more famously by many in the Science for the People group, right, which included people like Donna Haraway, but also Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould, and them having fights with people like Edward Wilson, who kind of promote sociobiology, and how much is sociobiology just a redeployment of social Darwinism and eugenics under polite, so-called polite, more seemingly scientifically grounded terms. Right, but then again, sort of, if you don't know the relevant history, these things can seem more inert politically than they actually are. And so, yeah, I didn't make this meme, but this is a pretty good summary of what people believe in terms of biology outside of biology, or the sort of politics of biology nowadays. Even though, three of these figures have passed away. So you have Lewontin on the top left, and you have Gould beneath him, and then you have Wilson, E.O. Wilson on the top, and then of course Dawkins is the last survivor. But this is the kind of polarization that is pretty standard whenever you see debates about what biology means for policy, what biology means for putting money into social systems, right? The same kind of eugenical arguments come up again and again, just in different language. This is something that Gould pointed out, right? The same things just get repackaged. And then, you have, I think part of the reason why trying to see these neglected stories and trying to understand what is biological about the politics of biology and what's political is that you've seen, especially, I think it's gotten much worse in the last 20 years, that that the center has shifted quite markedly to the right in terms of what's considered neutral biological fact and what that means. And of course, this is deployed in all kinds of racial politics and racist discourses. But we've also seen some, not quite an analogy, but something structurally similar with a lot of the anti-trans discourse, right? Which just completely uses the most like kindergarten understanding of biology to make, supposedly talk about facts and weaponize them in really sloppy ways. Okay. So to then talk, so that's sort of a lot of the broad strokes stuff, not everything, but yeah, sort of a lot to try to cover, but just try to bring a lot of these issues to a more specific case, like how these different stories and retellings, and sort of competing histories, and also, what's considered biological fact and what that means. We can talk about a specific case, which is this kind of idea of species problem, right? And this is sort of in the reading, in this kind of Richards reading about how do we define a species. It seems like a seemingly straightforward thing, but if you think about some of what I already mentioned in terms of how speculative or not these classification systems are trying to be or not trying to be, you know, how certain empirical evidence is conceptually loaded, right, in different ways, again, explicitly or not, consciously or not, right, that even something like species seems like it should be straightforward. But yeah, as we'll see, it's not really. And so part of the problem for this is that there's this sort of go-to definition of species that I should say biologists, not all biologists, but many biologists use, and that is the definition of species that's in most popular science books about biology. So this is often kind of like the population thinking concept. So Ernst Mayr popularized this. So it's the idea that a species is basically a group or a population of interbreeding organisms. Right. So it's that a population is like you can sort of, they look kind of similar, they can reproduce together, and they kind of live in the same place. But that definition is severely limited. It works quite well for mammals. You know, it works quite well for, well, like Meyer studied birds. It works, you know, fine for birds also. But the further you get away from mammals, for instance, the less that definition is helpful, because understanding what a population is very wonky. You're of course assuming that a species is straightforwardly dimorphous in its sexual characteristics, which, you know, is not true of mammals, and it's even like more evidently not true the further you get away, right? And it doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't help at all with bacteria. It's a very limited concept, but it's kind of the like at hand definition that many people use because they think it's sort of good enough. But the justification for that is also taken to Darwin. So Mayer, like in this book and in his other, he also wrote a sort of massive history of biology. It's like an 800-page textbook, and it's like, you know, seriously biased. But many people read it, this Growth of Biological Thought book. And in part because and this again to sort of point back to some of the dangers that I've mentioned, he sort of points back to Darwin and says, well, Darwin, you know, his definition of species was a population definition because Darwin thought about life in terms of populations. Now, I mean, we'll read some Darwin next week and talk about it, but I think this is decidedly not true. In that Darwin doesn't talk about populations, he talks about groups, right? Darwin is sort of interested in populations and statistics, you know, because of Malthus and these kinds of things. But Darwin is more interested in what's the difference between a species and a variety, right? That's not a population question, right? That you know, when you're staring at a giant field of flowers and you want to know, okay, how, you know, this is why botany kind of drove Darwin nuts. He loved it, but he kind of hated it at the same time. He was happy when other people did that work for him, like Asa Gray. Darwin said, you know, how do you know the difference between a variety of a flower and that it's a different species of flower, right? That's, you know, he spends so much time worrying about this. And, you know, Darwin doesn't have a working definition of species, despite the title of the book being Origin of Species. He sort of says, well, it's kind of like, you know, we're not going to have a good hard definition of it, but he's really more interested in like, how is it different from a variety? And he's really like struggling with this the whole book. And so that's that whole kind of struggle and emphasis is totally like obliterated by Mayer and other people, saying Darwin thought in terms of populations because he was thinking about evolution, and evolution is about genetic distribution, which of course Darwin wasn't there yet. So it's again a kind of retrojection, you know. So then we have to say, okay, what really, you know, what is a species? And you know, with some certain microorganisms or certain fungus, even a kind of question of hybridity, a question of morphology, like other distinctions you might use, become completely useless. So there's this, right, sort of some of these like microbial organisms which will differ hugely in terms of their morphology. They'll sort of start out like a slug and they'll kind of grow like a flower, and they kind of spray a bunch of genetic information somewhere, and then they'll kind of separate and become individual organisms again, right? So in terms of like a population, like the kind of logic is really broken. Or if you look at something like a coral reef, anything that's even a little bit symbiotic, you get a very different understanding of what a species is. Or what does hybridity mean, right? If its hybridity is not just about reproduction or not, right, you get other kinds of issues involved there. And this is why, like I said, it can go too far, but the work of people like Jan Sapp, who kind of talks about the history of symbiosis being something that people didn't really want to believe, becomes really important. Yeah, and so yeah, again, this point about species of variety, like I said, in botany is, really, really difficult to tell, which one is which, especially because in terms of, reproductive cycle or cross-pollination, right? It's not going to help you at all in botany to use this kind of population model of reproduction. I mean, plants in general are just not going to conform to the kinds of models that Mayer emphasizes and that a lot of people still use. So, and even to make matters even worse, and this is an example that quite a few people have used, is that, okay, even if you try a more seemingly straightforward definition of species, so it's about genetic similarity, right? So you could say, okay, it's not about population, it's about how many genes, this cluster of genes means you're a polar bear, this cluster of genes means you're a brown bear, and that doesn't work either. Because of course, because a species like polar bear, emerged out of hybridization, you can then track the genealogies of the bears. But if you take the genes from the nucleus versus from the mitochondria, you get completely different stories about who bred with who over how long of a time. So even if you take a seemingly straightforward story, developmental story about like large mammals, who you can say, okay, this is their community, this is where they came from, this is where they moved geographically over time, you get totally different pictures based on where you take the genes from. So there's really, I think people sort of find it hard to believe, but there's not a robust definition of species in biology. There just isn't one. And so, this is partly to my point that, and this was a point that Stephen Jay Gould made, especially in the last book, his last major book before his death, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, to say, like, we can't forget that biology is still a historical science, right? It's gotten more empirical, it's gotten more, the molecular techniques have become very sophisticated, but history makes like real material differences in biology that we can't sort of work around even when we try to do that. Okay, so the kind of last thing here I'll talk about, right, is the sort of philosophical side of this, right? And this was really, right, the emphasis of the Richards text of like, okay, maybe we can have a sort of philosophically or like more formal, right, if the matter, if the DNA, if the population interactions, if the behaviors don't give us something, maybe we can have some kind of philosophical sort of story. All right, and as Richard says in this chapter from his book, which is, I think, one of the better books about the species, the concept of species, right, as he says, this is also this notion of species, philosophically speaking or historically speaking. So even like, right before we even talk about biology, is weighted down and seriously plagued by these potted histories, right? These kind of convenient but sloppy histories of things. So, right, he talks about this essentialism story, right? This idea that, oh, well, a species, or an organism, which, you can't even use that, you're using that word anachronistically, right? So, like in ancient times, right, a living thing was what it was because it had some kind of essence, right? It had some kind of philosophical essence. It had some kind of essence to its being, right? It sort of had hoarseness or whatever you want to say. But then as Richards says, that doesn't really work at all. Even if you go all the way back to Aristotle, even if you look at Plato, which he doesn't talk about so much, this idea of essence being this kind of motionless thing, which allows something to be defined by what it is, just doesn't really work. Right. And again, you look at going back to this idea of classification logic, right? Even back in medieval times or even ancient times, you still have this divide often, right, between functions and differences, right? That even if you had something like an essence, it's not going to be a sort of metaphysical essence. It's going to be an essence in terms of like, what does it do, right? Like birds fly, fish swim. You can say that's kind of an essence of the thing, but that's only going to, that's not really going to give you the weight that you might hope. And then, of course, you can also do differences between species, right? You can say, well, right, birds tend to have talons and feathers, and but then, of course, well, some other things have feathers and some other things have talent, and then, you can try to sort of do a set of differences and kind of set up a classification system and sort of try to get to like, okay, well, these things always hold, and sort of try to build a philosophical essence for living things. But as Richards shows, right, this already is collapsing several different approaches, which are already kind of at work in the late medieval, early modern period, right, between realism, nominalism, and conceptualism. And so, right, the fact being that sort of realism is, some kind of like empirical kind of thing, way of defining species, right? The species sort of is what we can see, but that this had a kind of, this is, going back to the Riskin book, going back to what I said about Descartes, right? That this had a real theological weight, right? So something is what it was because it was made that way, right? So as soon as you start to talk about hybrids, or as soon as you start to talk about anything like transformation or later evolution, right, that becomes moot. That doesn't really do much for you. Then you have this approach of nominalism, right? This idea that basically, well, a species is just a kind of convenience. It's sort of what we say it is, right? It's a kind of word, it's a set of properties. And this is essentially, I think, the closest thing to what Darwin means. In that he sort of says in The Origin of Species, he's like, I don't really know. I don't really have a robust definition. I just think it's it's like a colloquial thing, basically. He kind of says, meh, like, I don't really know. Which again is funny because of the name of the book. And then conceptualism, which I think is the approach, that I'm most sympathetic to, is trying to find a way between these, right? That there is a degree of sort of pragmatism or colloquial thinking, but it does have to point to something kind of real that's sort of beyond what we can see in a sort of simplified version. But I think, there has to be some kind of balance between these things because, again, right, we might have realist or like pseudo-theological commitments, which are often going to be things that we don't know that we know, right? A kind of worldview is going to make us see things in a certain way. Whereas a kind of nominalist view is going to be maybe more sympathetic to functionalism or to a kind of pragmatic approach to how we interact with these things, or we see what they can do, right? Well, if they have hooves, they can do this. If they have wings, they can do that. So we'll call them like they're like these other things that do that, without kind of worrying about the underlying structure. But of course, once we start to talk about the molecular picture of life and things like this, that may become insufficient because it's not going to give us the deep history that we want. And so, right, for Richards, that's the kind of game that we kind of have to play, even when talking about someone that we think is straightforward, like Aristotle, like or Plato in terms of essences. But as I said, Richards doesn't really address Plato so much, but you can kind of see there's also this kind of neglected history of Plato's relationship to biology. And this is also in the comment I made earlier when I said that in Green and Depew's book that they don't really understand how a biologist could also be an idealist. And of course, if you understand Plato, not in terms of these kinds of like totally abstract ideal essences, but rather that there's a series of forms and that those forms manifest themselves materially, but in different mediums, which is this is the argument of a book like Wentworth Thompson's on growth and form, right? His point is like, he has this kind of completely materialist reading of biology on the one hand, saying, well, it's just the result of physics and how different shapes stick together. And then we can see these shapes in different forms, and then we can kind of read biology as a kind of Platonic morphology, basically. But because it's all about material instantiation, there's no timelessness or changelessness. He's just sort of saying, there's spirals in nature, but they manifest, in different mediums in different ways. So even that, and interestingly, Wentworth Thompson also translated a lot of Aristotle's work on biology, which had been completely neglected for a very long time. So even the possibility of that story is kind of made by this neglected period of philosophy of biology. So there's also this kind of weird moment there. Okay, so then this is to close, sort of just to close out before we kind of just, I'm sorry, before we do introductions. This is just a scheme that I'll use throughout the class and also for the next the unit as well. This is just a kind of teaching device mostly, but I think it's very helpful in trying to keep and classify how all these things fit together. And so these are just a series of interlocking concepts which I kind of use to read the history of biology, the philosophy of biology, that I find useful. But yeah, you can sort of take it or leave it. And of course, these concepts aren't strictly biological, but I think every bit of sort of every development in biology or every kind of the history of biology kind of has to deal with these four concepts kind of pushing against each other. And I think it's a way of being able to kind of frame what's happening over time. And when you emphasize one, you kind of de-emphasize another. And so it's kind of like this pull between these four things, between agency, force, function, and form. And yeah, actually, I still don't like the word force, but I'm not sure what else I want to use, but I'll just kind of go through these and then we can kind of close out with the introductions. And then of course with questions if people have questions, and we can do the introductions next week, depending on how the time goes. Okay, but just to sort of run through these. So agency, I imagine is probably familiar to people, right? In the sense that this is the capacity of an organism to act in a goal-oriented manner. And this is a really sort of a particularly hot topic right now in philosophy of biology. Of course, in continental circles, it's sort of old hat, I guess. But in a lot of more analytically minded people, agency is becoming, or organismal agency in particular, is becoming a bigger and bigger topic. There's huge research funds dumping tons of money into it. There's just tons of projects going on right now, multinational, gigantic things. And in part, it's sort of to do biology at the level of the organism and not focus on genetics, for instance. But so the example here of like what constitutes, what's not just programming, but what constitutes like proper agency. One of the examples that's used is this bird. It's called a blue tit. It's a bird so there was a time period, right, when people would have milk delivered to their doorstep. And these birds learned to peel off the top of the milk bottle, and they would drink, you can see it in the picture, they would drink just the fat, right? Because the fat would settle to the top. And people couldn't understand, like, there's nothing in the bird's normal life that gives them this type of skill. They figured out how to open the bottle. And also they would also teach other birds how to do it. And then the other sort of telling thing was that once the milk became more homogenized, so there was no longer the layer of fat at the top, they stopped doing it. So there's a real sense that, like, they did something to get a very particular goal, which was not, which was outside of their comfort zone, behaviorally speaking. And then when it was no longer, worth the effort for them, they stopped doing it. So that's one example. You can still debate whether that, is true agency or not, but, that's one kind of complex behavior. But there's lots of examples I can give if people are interested in that. Okay, so force, like, again, I'm not in love with this word, but the idea of this is that how animals engage with sort of non-living environment, right? So beavers are the, obvious example, right? They are sort of they build these dams, they block a river, the river then floods an area, the area becomes a habitat, you get more bugs, you get more birds eating the bugs, you protect the trees from fires, the beavers can swim, so they swim faster than they walk, so they can move around a lot. They have a protected den that they build, right? This lodge that they build on the dam. The dam also functions as a bridge for land animals like bear and moose and deer to walk across, right? So the point being, it's the way in which animals kind of transform their environment, right? Not just that they fit to their environments, they engage with their environments in terms of moving and eating, but the ways in which animals are basically ecological actors, right? So you can also see this as an extension of agency in one way, but it involves a lot of sort of unintentional effects, which is why I think it's more about kind of processes or forces. Then the one that we've talked about already quite a bit, and I think is more straightforward, is form, right? So this would be the discourse of morphology, right? This is looking at biology and living things in terms of their development, right? Why do they take the shape that they do? What does this morphology have to do with their history, genetically speaking, environmentally speaking, in terms of their own agency? How have they affected their own, form, morphology? And then lastly, function, which is, what are the capacities of an organism? What is it talking about biology? Right, we talked about this with Cuvier, right? What does it mean talking about living things in terms of what they can do? This is a very specific case for me. I grew up with these things shooting blood at me. Actually, it only happened once, but this is a horned toad. So when they're frightened, they shoot blood out of their eyes, which is quite impressive. But right, this is like the sort of defense mechanisms, right? Ways of capturing prey, right? Viewing organisms in this light. Okay. And then I just put a raccoon because I'm in Canada right now and they're everywhere. Okay, so that's the kind of spiel I have for today. So yeah, we have, I guess, about a half an hour left. I want to make a note. I really do have to leave on time today because I have to catch a flight. But so it's up to people. If there's questions, we can just do questions, or if there's any comments, anything like that. Otherwise, we can do very brief introductions. So are there any questions or comments about anything? I know that was a lot, but it will be less going on.
Someone has their hands up, actually, Ben, if you can see it.
Thank you. I didn't see. Go ahead, or whoever it is can go ahead, because I don't see them. Arnab?
Ben, I was thinking of the the uh, the antiquity of biological thinking in the West, that from Aristotle and also Plato. But is there some precedence of uh, of biological thought in other parts of the world, in like in times of the exile age, like at the same time when Aristotle was developing his philosophy. So are there parallels across the world?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, unfortunately, like my knowledge of like I've engaged with like most of my knowledge of like non-Western things and critiques of biology is from a later period. So I know it more from like, 1800s and on, basically. So I don't know the antiquity story as well. I mean, I know a little bit about like for instance things happening in, well, I mean, of course you get the ways in which well, like Aristotle, of course, in various knowledges migrate right across the planet, and who keeps that knowledge, of course, has huge effects on that. But even like before that, like I know in certain like ancient Chinese thought, for instance, like the ideas you get. I mean, this also points to the idea about the kind of worldview, right, or the cosmology, right, in the sense that I think you get certain parallels in terms of experimentation and some of the empirical engagements. But then I think, for instance, in like Chinese medicine or in some of the early, like some of the things I do know about, like there's a sense that a lot of these barriers to, for instance, understanding physiology or anatomy don't exist in the same way because of this kind of theological, I don't know what else to call it, like Christian suprematism or whatever, right? The fact that like white Europeans see themselves as like the chosen people, and therefore like the body has a certain reverence, which of course changes over time, right? The fact that Da Vinci could, chop up bodies, but then you couldn't do that for a long time. Which like, so like that doesn't exist as far as I can tell, for instance, in like Chinese medicine or other things. But then there's also a sense, like I think there's a lot, and I don't know this work very well, but the sense of also like how the inside-outside barrier is viewed very differently. Like I think it's much more, again, I think it's much more extreme in like Aristotle, for instance, than it would be in like outside of Europe. I think, such as that word has meaning then. Like the idea, like I think that yeah, there's just a very different understanding of like inside outside. But yeah, unfortunately, I just don't know that period as well. So I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for that.
Has any comparative histories been written of the West and some other part of the world, like from antiquity uh, till contemporary times?
Most of the books wouldn't you could find ones of a particular period. And they could, most of them don't go like that far. But I know I can definitely send you some stuff. I mean, if you remind me, for instance, there's definitely stuff on medicine. Like medicine is one discourse where there's a lot of that kind of thing. But like biology in general, I don't know of one. Honestly, I can't think of one. Because again, I think it's also this problem that like people don't even do big biology books just about the West anymore. So like to do one that would be like even bigger than that, I don't think anyone could even like get published, sadly. But there's definitely ones of specific periods. But yeah, but I think medicine is the easiest place to find those. But also there's also like quite a few things on animal studies, right? So like how like beasts and like bestiaries were constructed across continents and stuff. There's also that too, for the same period.
Okay, Ben. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I think because of the time, maybe we'll save the introductions for next week, if that's okay with everybody. Because I think it would take too long. Yes, Jana?
Could you please elaborate more on why does biological thinking appear so late in the history of ideas, or why the difference between philosophical definition of being and life became crucial or became important?
Yeah, no, yeah, I mean that's a big one. And but I think it's really because yeah, I mean, at least in terms of the West, I think it's really about this notion that you needed, basically because of medical reasons and because of classificatory systems not being sufficient anymore, in terms of like the sort of inner life or inner capacities of organisms, that you needed a way to talk about, to sort of cut across living things that was materially tractable. That's basically like, I think that's kind of the short answer. I mean, the fact that it is like 1800, and like I said, like 3 different people kind of all at once, I think it's because you have you really have like the notion of transformationism really takes off. And I think once you have the idea that something like evolution is possible, because you have people writing about that around 1800, especially in Germany, that then you suddenly have to say, okay, there's something that makes living things that can't be, that like theology, however that's described, is insufficient to define, right? So like the fact that things are motivated by a soul, that's like not enough anymore. And so it's like that you need to be able to say, why are there these similarities and also possibilities of transformation across living things? We need a way to study that can combine multiple other discourses, right? So like medicine, physiology, anatomy, chemistry. So it just became a sort of, and I think, so it was both philosophers and practicing scientists who'd said this at the same time, basically. And then that was possible because of naturalism, right? Because to be a naturalist, you were kind of both. And so I think that's really what it is. I think it's a question that you needed something that was scientific in the sense of being experimentally tractable and graspable, but that wasn't like, that didn't over-determine human beings as being, they were animal-like, but they were not too animal-like. And so I think this is why you get the organism, right? The organism is like the first like little safe step to do that. So yes, we're all put together in a certain way, that makes us function, right? That doesn't risk anything scandalous, right? But then as soon as you start to, but that opens the door for then saying, well, maybe we all came from the same pile of ooze, right? Like you already had people saying that in 1800, because like, well, we all had to grow, we all had to develop out of similar things. We didn't have separate origins. That's the real kind of German contribution to that. And so then you sort of have to sort of put a system in place to talk about that. And so I think that's why. I think it's really about materialism pushing against theology, pushing against chemistry, and physics being something that might apply to living things. And it all kind of comes together at the same time. Any other comments or questions? Arnab, did you have another one?
Ben, I was thinking about what you said about transformations, transformations of form, as far as the history of biology is concerned. But there seems to have been a heretical tradition of transformation of the the soul or spirit that dates back to the Hermetic tradition, but got pushed into undercurrents during the Christian Middle Ages. And perhaps this manifests itself in the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch and in alchemical tracts. So the philosophy was there for the soul, but not for the body, as far as I think. And these were like mostly heretical also.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I mean, one of the interesting stories that's, I mean, it's true, like, right, the soul is driving or animating, right, the body, and the body's kind of inconsequential to that. But then so like, that's why, like I said, with this Descartes, for instance, like, these mechanical descriptions weren't like an offense, right? They were just like useful tools for talking about how this stuff moves. But you're not saying, right, the person is a robot, you're saying their body is a robot, but the person is still the soul, so it's fine. But then, of course, where that gets complicated, and like where, like, Riskin has a really interesting chapter about this in her book, is where, of course, the problem is the interaction, right? So, like, the sort of mind-body problem, but what's more interesting in her book that she emphasizes is that it was a political problem for Descartes. Because, right, the idea that, the soul piloted the body, that wasn't a problem, that there was a duality there, that's not a problem. But the problem becomes, is that, right, Descartes needs to publish his stuff. And he wants to also say, not only can the mind can pilot the body, but also the mind can overcome the influences of the body, right? This is why he writes about the passions and stuff. But then the really interesting thing is he wants to get his stuff published, right? But he has to get the approval of the Jesuits, right? Because they sort of control everything. And they have a problem. They have a metaphysical problem with his thing, because they say, well, but if there's a divide between mind and body, how do miracles work? Right? Like, how can Jesus then, like, make, water into wine and these kinds of things? So it's suddenly, like, so it's a very different way, because, sometimes the mind-body problem is like, oh, he has to think of an interaction because Descartes was really, like, stuck and didn't know what to do. But the way she tells it, which I think is convincing, is it's like, well, no, it's actually like a political problem. So he has to sort of create, like, what's the minimal part, the minimal way that the body can push, that the body and the mind are actually interacting in a way that allows miracles to happen, but it doesn't break my whole philosophy. So, I mean, just to say like that, I think that's part to your point of, like, there's all these, like, slow little moves to sort of, like, limit the power of the soul, but, like, without looking like you're doing that, right? Because politically you just couldn't get away with that. And yeah, so I think, but again, like, Riskin's book would be like the place to look, because she goes into detail about, like, how that's, like, then slowly changed. Yeah, basically, and again, that's why biology comes from, especially like from Lamarck, right? The term becomes, it's like a materialist argument, right? Biology is very much like historical materialist claim, but it has to deal with all this theological baggage, right? Which still persists then. So then this idea that the soul, has a tiny bit of material limitation, you get that with Descartes, and then it, like, slowly increases. Until, I mean, you could say one of the, I think then that's why you get all these naturalists, right? Like before Darwin, trying to basically have it both ways, right? To sort of have transformationism in these things, but to say, oh, but there's still a divine role, right? And then those are the people that Darwin basically takes their arguments and, turns them upside down, basically. But yeah, but it takes what, like 300 years or something for that to happen.
Thank you, Ben.
Any last questions? We just have just a few minutes left. Yeah, Bakaya?
Hello, Ben. Thanks for very comprehensive introduction. Just a small question in regarding to this first part, which seems like you focus a lot on philosophical discussions and historical context. Can you maybe give a complete picture between this first part and the second part, which is next year, right? What
Yeah.
would happen then? Just to have an idea.
Yeah, so the second part is, so basically this class will kind of go up to the modern synthesis, so like up until the 1940s, kind of 50s, where you kind of get you know, the discovery of DNA is more or less where we're end. But then the next, yeah, the sort of next class will be just focusing on the sort of 60s to the present. And so in that sense, it will be you know, the kind of how the sort of genetic picture kind of kicks off and runs all the way up to the Genome Project, where you get attempts to sequence everything, this kind of DNA-centric view, how it gets resisted for political reasons, in part, which I mentioned a bit, right, with like Science for the People and people like Gould, how that kind of goes into sociobiology, right, in the 60s and 70s, and then sort of how the genetic how this kind of gene-centric view starts to get undermined and complicated already in the 80s by the discovery of, right, new classifications of microbial life, with sort of symbiosis story, with the politics around symbiosis, right, the kind of post-Cold War study, and then the class would sort of end, and then all the developments in molecular genetics, and then the class would sort of end most likely with epigenetics, and especially the politics of that and the sort of political use of epigenetics with and against in different ways, this kind of resurgence of eugenics, right? It's because like a big part of a project that I'm finishing now, which is on it's on Sylvia Wynter. Basically, it's rereading the history of biology through Sylvia Wynter. So a big part of that is sort of understanding how and why eugenics has come back. Like it's gotten more popular in the last decade in particular, but maybe even 20 years. So it's kind of leading to that point. So yeah, and so again, like how you have to have this kind of philosophical and historical and political view of things. But yeah, I mean, today was much more philosophical just because I wanted to get out some of the big kind of concepts and problems that kind of come up again and again, and then we'll be more like into the weeds and talk more about, there'll be more history, or I'd say more politics for sure, and more history and less philosophy as time goes on, hopefully. But I know today was a bit front-loaded.
Oh, I just saw that it's actually in November. All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, any last questions before we end for the day? Yeah, that's all.
Can we go through, but early next week, maybe, can we go through the assignments that you were talking about, or can you send us an email about it actually? Maybe it would be better just to get it
Yeah, I'll send an email.
you.
Yeah, I'll send it. Yeah, sorry about that. I'm just a bit, I had too much to say, unfortunately, but I'll talk less in the future. Yeah, I'll send an email about the assignments. And yes, we can also maybe we'll start next week with the introductions. So everyone, I'll send that in the email too. But yeah, if everyone can just think about, yeah, basically just what's your background and sort of why you're interested in the course. But yeah, I'll send an email about that with just the broad outline of the assignments, and then people can ask me about the assignments if it doesn't make sense, if that's okay. Okay, I guess with that, thank you everyone for bearing that much of me talking, and I hope we'll have, yes, more discussion and more specificity as time goes on.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Ciao.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. Bye.